Britain's new Prime Minister says the decision to leave the European Union is final. But how will that process work? My guest here in Brussels is Daniel Hannan, Conservative MEP and one of the driving forces in the Leave campaign. But how honest was his campaign? And what happens if he can't deliver on his promises? Daniel Hannan, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
You were a leading light of the Vote Leave campaign. You helped run what former Prime Minister John Major called a deceitful campaign verging on the squalid. Do you recognise your campaign from that description?
Well, obviously not. I mean,
he wouldn't make it up, would he?
Well, he was campaigning on the other side, so of course those are his opinions.
He was a very respected former statesman.
You know, in every campaign that I've ever been involved with, and I'm sure in every campaign, Tim, that you've ever covered, there have been good and bad arguments on both sides, and I think this one was no exception.
But he wasn't just talking about good and bad, he was talking about what he said, a whole galaxy of inaccurate and frankly untrue information. Voters were being misled by a deceitful campaign.
Well, shall we go through some of the things that were said in the campaign and that have turned out?
Well, I think we will come to that.
May I offer a couple of them?
Well, I want to come to them in some kind of order, but just before we leave that point, you never stretched a fact in this campaign?
In every campaign, some people have, and no, I don't think I ever did, but some people on both sides used good and bad arguments. But if
you saw people on Vote Leave using bad arguments, using misleading, misleading arguments.
The whole country was involved in this campaign, so of course there were good and bad arguments on both sides.
That's not an excuse for misleading people, is it?
I don't think I've misled anyone.
Well, what about your campaign? As you were a leading light of the campaign.
Some people who were campaigning for a Leave vote used bad arguments.
You were on the campaign committee, didn't you rein them in? Didn't you want to rein them in?
Well, in life, we are responsible for what we do. Right? We're not responsible for every ally who might have reached the same position as us.
You were a senior member of the Vote Leave campaign. You were on the weekly campaign committee. You were on the weekly campaign, but you set the strategy. You set the strategy. You helped set the strategy. Please do.
Well, here are a number of things that were said during the campaign that I think may now be fairly decried as false. We were told that there would be an emergency budget, that there'd have to be emergency tax rises. We're now being told there'll be tax cuts. We were told that our immigration officers would be thrown out of France. The French government has now said that's not going to happen.
You're not responsible for what the other side said. I'm only going to hold you responsible for what you said and what your campaign said.
Hold me responsible for what I said.
Let's deal first with what appear to be radically conflicting claims by you and other leading lights in your campaign. Right after the vote, you caused something of a stir on television by saying that you favoured the free movement of workers to and from the UK. It means free movement of labour. You said it doesn't mean EU citizenship. My question is, at what point did you declare in the campaign, vote Brexit, it'll mean free movement?
Throughout, at every
Give
meeting,
me an example.
Well, actually,
give me one example. Give me one example.
If you'll allow me to, I will, Tim. Yeah. Yes, on that very programme, sitting around that very table with that very same interviewer at the start of the campaign, I had said exactly the same thing. I'd written a book called Why Vote Leave, which sets it all out, which sold 20,000 copies. I hardly think I can be accused of sneaking this out in the small print.
It'll mean free movement of labour.
Oh, yes, it does. Very clearly.
What page? What number?
I can't tell you the page now, but read the chapter on how EFTA works and how EFTA, although no country is going to be an exact model for Britain, provides a broad template for how, at least in the medium term, a post-EU Britain might retain some advantageous links with our immediate neighbours and allies while bringing back control.
This is free movement. It's not advantageous links. It's free movement.
Of labour.
It's what people were voting to get rid of when they voted on your side. You know that.
In 1973, we joined the EEC and we accepted the rule that if you have a firm job offer in another country, you may take it up, and that's reciprocal, right? And I don't remember there being any complaints about that. Now, when Maastricht came in and European citizenship came in, that was a huge shift.
What you campaigned on. And by the way, your fellow Vote Leave campaigner, Michael Gove, who wanted to become Prime Minister, had another view entirely. I will end free movement, he said.
Well, necessarily, on both sides there were coalitions, but the idea that...
Well, you couldn't get your stories together. You're for free movement and he's against it.
We very clearly said that we will take back control. Now, taking back control of immigration, in my book, can mean only one thing, which is that a foreign court will no longer get to determine who can reside in the UK or who can enter the UK.
No, but Daniel Hannan, let me just clarify that.
Just once allow me to answer. Having taken back control, there is nothing to stop an independent British Parliament from reaching whatever bilateral or multilateral treaties with other countries as directed by the public. For example, we've had free movement with the Irish Republic since 1923. We did that as a sovereign country long before we were
You're getting off the subject of the question. My question was, Gove is pledging to end free movement in line, he says, with the promises made by the campaign. You said the campaign didn't make that promise.
We said we would take back control, and we will.
You, by contrast, saying we never made the promise and free movement should continue.
We will take back control. That does not mean zero immigration, and I don't think anyone can claim that we said it would mean zero immigration. We hardly sneaked this out in the small print. At the final debate, Boris Johnson went out of his way to say, I'm for an amnesty for illegal...
He says down to the tens of thousands, and you say free movement. It's not the same thing, is it?
Freedom to take up a job offer is not the same as freedom to settle in a country in perpetuity.
No wonder people are confused, aren't they?
Well,
by your campaign, because you've got two different voices. Gove says he's ending free movement. You say free movement should continue.
We had
That's
more
what
than
it
two
comes
different
down
voices,
to.
Tim, because maybe I need to explain that it's a referendum. There were people from the far left, there were people from the centre, there were people from the centre-right, there were trade unions campaigning against, there were people from a multiplicity.
And you didn't think with Gove
the one thing we all agreed on is to take back control. What we then do, having taken back control, will be a matter for Parliament. That's how democracy works.
You were upset by this road back because you said on Twitter, chaps, look at what I said throughout the campaign. It's all on Twitter, YouTube. I was for more control, not for minimal immigration.
Right.
Yes, you wanted more control.
Correct.
Sure. But at no point did you advertise what you later blurted out on the BBC, Brexit will still mean free movement of labour.
I advertised it in the Spectator debate. I advertised it on Twitter.
Really?
I advertised it in...
You actually said Brexit
I
means...
wrote a book about it.
Brexit means free movement of labour.
Yes.
Well, you certainly didn't during the
I
height of the campaign.
actually put out a video, which I made here, about how the European Free Trade Association works, how it means accepting the four freedoms while bringing back sovereignty in other areas. This is not something that I try to sneak out quietly.
Yes, the campaign was
somebody else said something else. Well, do you know what? It's a referendum.
But you were campaigning together. Now you say you were campaigning separately. You were just a bunch of people united by what?
Agreed on.
United by what?
United by taking back control so that it's for Britain to decide. The whole purpose of taking back our democracy
but what did that
is that
mean?
instead
that
of these decisions,
didn't it?
What it means is that we are in control again.
It did to Michael
How
Gove.
we exercise that control is up to a sovereign parliament. That, Tim, is what democracy means. It means that instead of foreign courts telling us what to do, we decide through our own national democratic institutions and mechanisms. That's the thing we all agreed on. That's the thing we're now going to deliver.
Okay, but it's going to look very different if one of them says free movement, yes, and the other one says free movement,
That
no.
will be a robust debate within our democratic system, and the British people will decide that, not having anybody else telling them what to do.
And you couldn't get your story straight before the vote.
Our story was very straight. It was
I'm just pointing out those are the key differences. Okay, all right, let's look at the aftermath. You said, I mean, all of this promised market chaos, you said 5 days after the vote, all this promised market chaos hasn't really happened in the UK. Our stock exchange is back to where it was before the vote. So everything's fine.
Yeah, if you look at what we were told...
Rose-tinted view, isn't it?
If you look at what we were being told before, that, you know, the German finance minister, who now says, well, we'll have to find a special deal for Britain, he was asked, but you said in the campaign, out means out, that Britain will be treated like any third country. He said, yeah, well, that's what George Osborne told me to say. You know, the President of the United States said that you'll be at the back of the queue. Now they're saying we'll have a deal with you before we have one with the EU.
Who is now they're saying? The White House is saying?
The White House has conspicuously refused to repeat that back of the queue line.
And the
Speaker of Congress has said, we will do this much more easily than we'll do one with the EU.
That's not on behalf of the US government, is it?
But at the NAFTA meeting...
So when you say they're saying this, it's one
at the trilateral NAFTA meeting, when Barack Obama was invited to repeat that back of the queue remark, he conspicuously failed to do so.
You mentioned the Germans. Let's look at some of the effects that are coming into focus here. More than a third of German businesses plan to reduce investment in Britain, and 1 in 4 to cut jobs in the UK. This according to a poll by the DIHK, which is Germany's Chamber of Commerce. The figures, it says, show that Britain as a business location will clearly be weakened by Brexit.
Well, obviously, I disagree with
that. Jobs to be lost.
Obviously, I disagree with that. I think that 5 years from now, Britain will be flourishing as never before, and people will look back and wonder why we didn't do this long before.
Well, you can't get the Germans to say that. At least
let's see what actually happens. After all this time, Tim, I'd have thought you'd be a bit more careful about quoting surveys at me.
At least 6 property funds have been unable to meet withdrawal requests after the Brexit vote and have stopped investors leaving their UK property funds.
Well, in any week, you're going to have some good economic news and some bad economic news. I don't think
this is tied absolutely to Brexit. Of course it is.
So was the decision of Tata Steel now not to leave Wales. That was tied absolutely to Brexit. The decision to carry on making things at Pinewood Studios, that was tied absolutely to Brexit. You know, there is good and bad news. There are winners and losers in everything. But I really do want to reassure
winners and losers. You said in your book, page 13 of the intro, no jobs will be lost.
Well, my job will be lost. I mean,
apart from, you said, those of a few hundred British bureaucrats and MEPs, including me.
I have
no jobs will be lost.
I have absolutely no doubt that Britain will be a more global, more deregulated, more free trading country 5 years from now.
Jobs
and
would
therefore,
be lost.
Yeah, overall employment is going to be higher.
You couldn't ever give a promise like that. You couldn't ever deliver on a promise like that, that not a single job will be lost because of Brexit.
Because of Brexit, apart from the Eurocrats, no. Of course there
are
jobs
the Germans are already telling
you
they're going to, 1 in 4 plan to cut jobs in the UK. What are you doing about that?
Let's see. Let's see what happens. Because
when people you make these promises that you can't deliver on.
Well, as I say, let's see what happens. Britain will remain a global country, interested and involved with the affairs of every continent, including Europe. I don't think there's going to be any prejudicial change to our commercial relations with our European allies, who will remain our friends and allies in any circumstances. But I think there will now be a long overdue emphasis on our relations with non-EU markets, which of course are the markets that are growing the fastest.
The Virgin billionaire Richard Branson is also warning thousands of jobs will be lost. 5 days after the referendum, he met with a group of Chinese business partners who've invested heavily in the UK, he said, and are now going to stop investing and withdraw the investments they've made. But you think it's all fine?
Well, so far that hasn't been happening. There are actually more startups in London in the 2 weeks since the vote than before.
This is the intention.
Yes, but how many people before the vote, including the chairman of Barclays, including Siemens, suggested that they might revisit investment decisions and have now, since the vote, rode back from what they said during the campaign because they were obviously under some pressure from the Remain side. I think very quickly a lot of these scare stories are going to be exposed as what they were.
You think based on what?
On what they're saying now, that they were saying one thing before the vote when they were trying to pressure us into voting to remain in. Now that the vote is out of the way, they're saying, well, of course we're still committed. Of course we're going to carry on investing here. And in the cases that I've just cited, Tata Steel and Pinewood, they're now making additional commitments because of Brexit and because of the more competitive exchange rate.
No jobs will be lost. And we're supposed to believe that you are the keeper of the sacred truth. No, I mean, no wonder Neil Ferguson, the history professor at Harvard, when he was reviewing your book, he said, you were glossing over the risks of Brexit in ways that would disgrace an undergraduate essay.
He was campaigning on the other side.
It doesn't matter. He's a respected historian.
Oh,
He's
so that
one
makes
of the
him
world's
right
respected.
automatically.
Well, it's his view.
Okay, it's his view.
You were glossing over. Anybody who says no jobs are going to be lost.
Well, obviously it's not my view. I would not have been inviting people to fire me from a very well remunerated position if I didn't think that it would be the interest of the UK economy as a whole, and that 5 years from now we'll be a much more prosperous country.
Your campaign rubbished most experts and continues to rubbish most experts that think differently, didn't you? I mean, Michael Gove said the British people have had enough of experts, famously. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, in May, your campaign called it a paid-up arm of the European Commission. Mm-hmm. You stand by that? Paid-up arm of the European Commission?
Fact, they do get money from the European
10% they get from the European Research Council that funds academic research around the world. Yes, but 10%.
But the problem
that makes them a fully paid-up arm
not fully,
of the European Commission. So you exaggerated. The campaign exaggerated.
The problem with the IFS report is that they fed in all of the data and assumptions that were produced by some think tanks and institutes that were much more heavily dependent on EU funding. I think we saw a groupthink among economists in exactly the same way that we did about joining the euro.
But you don't stand by this paid-up arm of the European Commission.
I think their assessment was wrong. Isn't it? No, I think their assessment was wrong.
So your campaign was wrong on this?
Well, obviously, they're not fully funded by the European Commission, of course not.
A paid-up arm of the European Commission is an exaggeration, isn't it?
Correct.
Okay, so you criticise your campaign for that. Barack Obama, well, he was criticised, as Boris Johnson said, that was down to the part Kenyan president's ancestral dislike of the British Empire. That was what decided his view. You stand by that too?
No, those weren't my words. I mean, you can spend the whole interview asking me to stand by things that I didn't say.
No, I think it's important to know whether you stand by.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think he was
wrong. What
about
the criticism of Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England?
Well,
I mean,
I mean, there are criticisms.
Your campaign smeared him, didn't it?
If you're asking me for my own view rather than asking me for somebody else's, I think there is a huge criticism to be made of Barack Obama's intervention, and it was that he was urging on the UK a policy that he would never dream of following for his own country. You know, he would never accept a superior jurisdiction for the Organization of American States able to strike down laws of Congress. He would never accept a Pan-American peso being, you know, administered by some central bank in Havana or whatever. And so he was urging us to accept limitations on independence.
But to dismiss his ideas and put them down to the fact of his part Kenyan ancestral dislike of the British Empire is not only rude, but it's undiplomatic.
I think it was unfair. I think it was unfair. Although, you know...
So your campaign's been unfair.
It was unfair, although it is...
But Mark Carney, I wanted to move on to the governor
of the
Bank of England.
It is only fair that Barack Obama, in his book, in his own biography, talks about reasons why there was an ancestral dislike of the British Empire.
Mark Carney, you rubbished him. Andrea Leadsom said he intentionally encouraged financial instability.
I do wish he'd cheer up a bit, yeah.
And then came, that is quite a different point, then came a vote leave video, didn't it? And you on the campaign committee presumably signed off on this, smearing him for his previous career at Goldman Sachs and putting up the caption over his face which said, "Some say Goldman Sachs is still pulling the strings today." That was tendentious and prima facie it was defamatory, wasn't it?
I think there is an absolutely legitimate point to be made about the way in which Goldman Sachs and other mega banks were pouring money into the Remain campaign to defend their own narrow interests rather than the interests of financial services more broadly, let alone the UK population.
You were suggesting that he was having his strings pulled by Goldman Sachs, and you had no evidence for that. But that's when the caption goes up over his head.
I think it's absolutely fair. If the other side is taking money from Goldman Sachs, it is absolutely fair for us to point out that Goldman Sachs has invested millions over many years in getting a regulatory regime in Brussels that suits them and hurts their rivals, and that was why they were so determined to stay, and it was nothing to do with the interests of the UK economy.
Daniel Hannan, the words "some say," as you know, are the last resort of a journalist who doesn't have the facts, aren't they? They were used, that expression was used the whole time by Pravda in his vestiaire during the Cold War. Some say he's getting money from this.
This is entirely what you're doing to me. You're saying, here's something that someone else has said, you're responsible for it.
Well,
you're doing exactly what you're doing the Pravda here. Admit it.
You are a leader, you were a leader of the Vote Leave campaign, you were on the campaign committee, you helped chart the strategy every week. Every week you sat down with these people. So you have some responsibility for this, don't you? Like the pledge to divert the £350 million a week you claim Britain sends to the EU, divert it to the National Health Service.
I absolutely
which turned out not to be a pledge.
I absolutely stand by the £350 million a week figure. That is a gross figure, and obviously, people understand the difference between gross and net. They understand that if you ask what your salary is, it's the gross, not the net figure.
But the chair of the UK Statistics Authority said the statement was potentially misleading.
I disagree with that. I'm absolutely prepared to defend that figure. If you say to somebody, you know, what's basic rate income tax, they will say to you, it's 20p in the pound. They won't say, oh, well, I'd better deduct all the stuff that I get back in roads and schools and
hospitals. He said the use of the £350 million figure appears to be a gross figure, does not take into account the rebate or other flows from the EU to the UK public sector or flows to non-public sector bodies. This statement is potentially misleading, but you went on using it anyway.
Yes, and I stand by it.
You didn't mind being misleading?
I don't think it was misleading. No, I disagree with that.
And what about the going to the National Health Service, this idea of sending, let's give our NHS the £350 million the EU takes every week?
Well, if a Leaver had won the Prime Ministership, I think both Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, and indeed Andrea Leadsom, had made clear that they would give that money to the NHS because they felt bound by those promises.
But you already had Ian Duncan Smith, also of your campaign, saying, oh, that was just an extrapolation. It's not a broken promise. I never said that through the course of the election. What I said, we'll be able to spend the lion's share of that money. This poster was very clear. Let's give our NHS, National Health Service, the £350 million that the EU takes every week. Let's give them that money. Not an extrapolation, not a bit of it here, is it? It was clear.
Well, may I answer?
Please.
People understand the difference between a general election and a referendum. When you vote leave, you're not voting to elect a new government. You're mandating the government to leave. Like you instruct a lawyer, you're instructing the government to get us out. In doing so, you're freeing up the money that we're currently giving to the EU, or at least you will be when exit takes effect. Obviously, it is for a future government to determine how that money is going to be spent. People are perfectly capable of understanding that. Had they elected one of the levers of the Vote Leave campaign, I think they would have elected, as leader and as Prime Minister, someone who would have felt morally obliged to stick by that promise. But what is clear is that the money will then be there for Parliament to spend on whatever combination.
But there was your campaign afterwards saying, well, we weren't going to give it, we weren't going to give the 350 million. Actually, that was just an extrapolation. That's not an excuse for a poster that says quite clearly, let's give the 350 million to the National Health Service.
You can refight the campaign as many ways as you like. It's still going to have the same outcome. Yeah, people understood the issue and they voted to take back control.
They may have voted. What about Turkey? Your poster, Turkey is joining the EU. Vote Leave poster, presented as unassailable fact. Turkey is joining the EU. No doubt, no caveat, it's going to happen. It's not true, is it? Simply not true. You don't know whether it's true or not.
I think it was a fair thing that it was to say that it was both UK government policy and EU policy for that to happen.
You didn't say that. You said it's going to happen.
Yes. I think that's a fair thing to say when both the British government and the European authorities are saying that it's going to happen.
And Angela Merkel had already made clear that she'd vote against it.
Well, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. But the day after our referendum, the European Commission confirmed that it was still on course.
It may have confirmed it's still on course, but Angela Merkel has said it's not going to happen. If you were interested in the truth over Turkey, you would have corrected what Penny Mordaunt said, who denied that Britain had a veto over Turkey's accession to the European Union. Yeah, and that was left standing.
Penny was incorrect about that, yeah.
Yeah, but nobody corrected her. You didn't get up and say,
I'm happy to correct her now. That was incorrect.
Well, why would you let something like that stand when it achieved a lot of publicity? People saying, no, this isn't true, but your campaign stayed silent because presumably you hoped that somebody would actually accept it as truth.
I don't think so. I think people completely get... I mean, what all this comes down to is you're saying basically that voters were very thick and that they were led astray by unscrupulous people.
I'm saying these things misled them.
I have a higher opinion of my fellow countrymen than that. Like I said right at the beginning...
They were supposed to read between the lines, weren't they, Daniel
Like I said right at the beginning, there are good and bad arguments on all sides in every campaign. There were good and bad arguments on the Remain side and on the Leave side. By and large, you can rely on people to suss out where the truth lies. They do so in most general elections. They did so on this occasion.
So they were just supposed to read the line, between the lines. They weren't supposed to take at full face value anything you said.
You could spend the whole of the rest of this interview throwing at me things that other people have said, right?
No, but
I'm happy to stand by what I said.
I'm just quoting the exact words that were on your posters.
I see you're planning to then. All right, carry on.
No, but the exact words that were on your posters and asking you whether they were true, and it turns out they haven't been in some places.
On the poster that said Turkey's on its way to membership, I think when the European authorities and the British government...
It didn't say it's on its way, it says Turkey is joining, fact.
In other words, that was stating the policy of
it
both the UK government and the European Union.
But you know, as well as I do, it's very unlikely to happen.
No, I disagree. I think it probably
particularly
will happen.
With Turkey's disastrous human rights record.
It may now not happen, because the only way in which it will not happen is if the UK, in this renegotiation, establishes some kind of looser status, some kind of association with the EU that is inside the market but outside political union, then it may well be that Turkey and some of the EFTA countries and some other non-EU states might wish to copy that relationship and to follow us into a similar association, which I think would solve a number of problems and would make Brexit a mutually beneficial process that brings advantages to the remaining EU as well as to the UK.
All right. How long does Britain have to go on living in chaos and uncertainty, political chaos, economic uncertainty, which of course is bad for growth? The pound goes down, it's bad for people who want a holiday this summer, it's bad for imports because they keep rising.
I disagree. I think the pound was hugely overvalued. I think it was long due a correction. And just as in 1992 and 2008, the correction when it happened was a prelude to strong economic growth. And by the way, of all the promises of economic chaos that we were given by the Remain side, the only thing that has come true is this long overdue decline in the value of sterling. All of the other things that we were told would happen, the collapse in the stock exchange and the emergency tax rises, all of that has been forgotten.
What would have to happen along the way for you to say, we got it wrong, sorry?
Well, if
I shouldn't have done this, I'm on the wrong side, because some people are already saying they voted the wrong way.
Yeah, and more people the other way are saying that they should have voted...
Well, not according to opinion, no.
OK, well, the one poll I saw, 3% of Leave voters regretted it and 4% of Remain voters.
A poll conducted by ITV and Cardiff University asked people to imagine another referendum, same question, showed a 6% swing towards Remain.
These were the same polls that kept showing Remain ahead all the way through. I'd have thought you'd have by now learnt not to,
well, you're
trust
quoting polls at me.
Well,
you're quoting polls at me.
The test is going to be what's Britain going to be like after we've come out, because obviously there's a procedure to go through. We want to make sure that we're fair to the other member states and that we get this right, that we get advantageous terms for all sides.
Is it worth breaking up the union? Worth breaking up?
I think we can strengthen the union.
UK?
The UK union.
The UK union,
No,
yes.
Well, I think we can't disregard the fact that the UK is a partnership of nations. 2 of the 4 nations returned Remain majorities, and therefore we can't wish that fact away. We have to find a common negotiating position that all of us can at least live with, that may go too far for some and not far enough for others, but around which a consensus can form in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well as in England and Wales.
All right, Daniel Hannan, we have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed.